When I was a little boy, I was playing with some of my friends in the attic of an old abandoned log house in northwest Missouri. As I climbed down out of the attic, I rested my feet on a windowsill for a moment, and then jumped. I had a ring on my left forefinger, and as I jumped, the ring caught a nailhead and tore off my finger. I screamed. I was terrified. I was positive I was going to die. But after the hand healed, I never worried about it for one split second. What would have been the use? I accepted the inevitable. Now, I often go on for months at a time without even thinking about the fact that I only have 3 fingers and a thumb on my left hand. A few years ago, I had met a man who was running a freight elevator in one of the downtown office buildings in New York. I noticed that his left hand had been cut off at the wrist. I asked if the loss of that hand had bothered him. He said, "Oh no, I hardly ever think about it. I'm not married, and the only time I ever have to think about it is when I try to thread a needle." It is astonishing how quickly we accept almost any situation, if we have to, and just adjust ourselves to it and forget about it. I often think of the inscription of the ruins of a 15th century cathedral in Amsterdam, Holland. The inscription says in Flemish, quote, "It is so. It cannot be otherwise." As you and I march across the decades of time, we're going to meet a lot of unpleasant situations that are so. They cannot be otherwise. We have our choice. We can either accept them as inevitable or adjust ourselves to them. Or we can ruin our lives with rebellion and maybe end up with a nervous breakdown. Here's a bit of sage advice from one of my favorite philosophers, William James. Quote, "Be willing to have it so," he said. "Acceptance of what has happened is the first step to overcoming the consequences of any misfortune." Elizabeth Conley of Portland, Oregon had to find that out the hard way. Here's a letter that she wrote to me. Quote, "On the very day that America was celebrating the victory of our armed forces in North Africa," the letter says, "I received a telegram from the War Department. My nephew, the person that I loved the most, was missing in action. A short time later, another telegraph arrived saying he was dead. I was prostrate with grief. Up to that time, I'd felt that life had been very good to me. I had a job I loved. I had helped to raise this nephew. He represented to me all that was fine and good in young manhood. I had felt that all of the bread I had cast upon the waters was coming back to me as cake. Then came this telegram. My whole world collapsed. I felt there was nothing left to live for. I neglected my work, neglected my friends. I let everything go. I was bitter and resentful. Why did my loving nephew have to be taken? Why did this good boy, with life all before him, why did he have to be killed? I couldn't accept it. My grief was so overwhelming that I decided to give up all my work and go hide away myself in my tears and bitterness. I was clearing out my desk, getting ready to quit, when I came across a letter that I had forgotten. A letter from this nephew who had been killed. A letter he had written to me when my mother had died a few years ago. Of course we all miss her, the letter said, and especially you, but I know you'll carry on. Your own personal philosophy will make you do that. I shall never forget the beautiful truths you taught me. Wherever I am, or how far apart we may be, I shall always remember that you taught me to smile and to take whatever comes, like a man. I read and reread that letter. It seemed as if he were there beside me, speaking to me. He seemed to be saying to me, why don't you do what you taught me to do? Carry on no matter what happens. Hide your private sorrows under a smile and carry on. So I went back to work. I stopped being bitter and rebellious. I kept saying to myself, it is done, I can't change it, but I can and will carry on as he wished me to do. I threw all my mind and strength into my work. I wrote letters to soldiers, to other people's boys. I joined an adult education class at night, seeking out new interests and making new friends. I can hardly believe the change that has come over me. I have ceased mourning over the past that is forever gone. I am living each day now with joy, just as my nephew would have wanted me to do. I have made peace with life. I have accepted my fate. I am now living a fuller and more complete life than I had ever known. Elizabeth Conley learned what all of us will have to learn sooner or later, namely that we must accept and cooperate with the inevitable. It is so, it cannot be otherwise. That is not an easy lesson to learn. Even kings on their thrones have to keep reminding themselves of it. The late George V had these framed words hanging on the wall of his library in the Buckingham Palace. Teach me neither to cry for the moon nor over spilt milk. The same thought is expressed by Schopenhauer in this way. A good supply of resignation is of the first importance in providing for the journey of life. A good supply of resignation is of the first importance in providing for the journey of life. Obviously, circumstances alone do not make us happy or unhappy. It is the way we react to circumstances that determine our feelings. Jesus said that the kingdom of heaven is within you. That is where the kingdom of hell is too. We can all endure disaster and tragedy and triumph over them if we have to. We may not think we can, but we have surprisingly strong inner resources that will see us through if we only make use of them. We are stronger than we think. The late Booth Tarkington always said, quote, I could take anything that life could force upon me except one thing, blindness. I could never endure that. Then one day, when he was along in his 60s, Tarkington glanced down at the carpet on the floor. The colors were blurred. He couldn't see the pattern. He went to a specialist. He learned the tragic truth. He was losing his sight. One eye was nearly blind and the other would follow. That which he feared the most had come to him. And how did Tarkington react to this worst of all disasters? Did he feel, this is it? This is the end of my life? No, to his amazement, he felt quite gay. He had even called upon his humor. Floating specks annoyed him. They would swim across his eyes and cut off his vision. Yet when the largest of these specks would swim across his sight, he would say, Hello, there's grandfather waiting. Wonder where he's going this fine morning. I don't know what I'm writing here. Hello, there's grandfather again. Wonder where he's going this fine morning. How could fate ever conquer a spirit like that? The answer is it couldn't. When total darkness closed in, Tarkington said, quote, I found I could take the loss of my eyesight just as a man could take anything else. If I lost all 5 of my senses, I know I could live on inside my mind. For it is inside the mind we see, and in the mind we live, whether we know it or not. In the hope of restoring his eyesight, Tarkington had to go through more than 12 operations within 1 year. With local anesthetic. Did he rail against it? He knew it had to be done. He knew he couldn't escape it. So the only way to lessen this suffering was to take it with grace. He refused a private room at the hospital and went into a ward where he could be with other people who had troubles too. He tried to cheer them up. And when he had to submit to repeated operations, fully conscious of what was being done to his eyes, he tried to remember how fortunate he was. How wonderful, he said, how wonderful that science has now the skill to operate on anything so delicate as the human eye. The average man would have been a nervous wreck if he had to endure more than 12 operations and blindness. Yet Tarkington said, I would not exchange this experience for a happier one. It taught him acceptance. It taught him that nothing in life could bring him what was beyond his strength to endure. It taught him, as John Milton discovered, that, quote, it is not miserable to be blind. It is only miserable not to be able to endure the blindness. Margaret Fuller, the famous New England feminist, once offered as her credo, I accept the universe. When grouchy old Thomas Carlyle heard that in England, he snorted, By God, she'd better. Yes, and by God, you and I had better accept the inevitable too. If we rail and kick against it and grow bitter, we won't change the inevitable. but we will change ourselves. I know. I've tried it. I once refused to accept an inevitable situation in which I was confronted. I played the fool and railed against it, and rebelled. I turned my nights into hells of insomnia. I brought upon myself everything that I didn't want. Finally, after a year of self-torture, I'd accept what I knew from the outset I couldn't possibly alter. I should have cried out years ago with old Walt Whitman. Oh, to confront night, storms, hunger, ridicule, accident, rebuffs, as the trees and animals do. I spent 12 years working with cattle, yet I never saw a Jersey cow running at temperature because the pasture was burning up from a lack of rain, or because of sleet and cold, or because her boyfriend was paying too much attention to another heifer. The animals confront night, storms, and hunger calmly, so they never have nervous breakdowns or stomach ulcers, and they never go insane. How am I advocating that we simply bow down to all the adversities that come our way? Not by a long shot. That is mere fatalism. As long as there is a chance that we can save a situation, let's fight. But when common sense tells us that we're up against something that is so and cannot be otherwise, then, in the name of our sanity, let's not, quote, look before and after and pine for what is not. The late Dean Hawkes of Columbia University told me that he had taken a Mother Goose rhyme as one of his mottos. For every ailment under the sun, there is a remedy, or there is none. If there be none, try to find it, and if there be none, never mind it. While writing this book, I interviewed a number of the leading business executives of America, and I was impressed by the fact that they cooperated with the inevitable and led lives singularly free from worry. If they hadn't done that, they would have cracked under the strain. Here are a few examples of what I mean. J.C. Penney, founder of one of the nationwide chain of penny stores, said to me, I wouldn't worry if I lost every dollar I have, because I don't see what is going to be gained by worrying. If I do the best job I can possibly can, and leave the results up to the laps of the gods. Henry Ford told me, Ryan Serhant says the same thing, right? You put in the work and the work will take care of you. Henry Ford told me much of the same thing. When I can't handle events, he said, I let them handle themselves. When I asked K.T. Keller, the president of the Chrysler Corporation, how he kept from worrying, he replied, when I am up against a tough situation, if I can do anything about it, I do it. If I can't, I just forget it. I never worry about the future because I know no man living can possibly figure out what is going to happen in the future. There are so many forces that will affect that future. Nobody can tell what prompts those forces or understands them. So why worry about it? K.T. Keller would be embarrassed you told him he is a philosopher. He is just a good businessman. Yet he has stumbled on the same philosophies as Epictetus taught in Rome 19 centuries ago. There is only one way to happiness, Epictetus taught the Romans, and that is to cease worrying about things which are beyond the power of our will. Sarah Bernhardt, the divine Sarah, was an illustrious example of a woman who knew how to cooperate with the inevitable. For half a century, she had been the reigning queen of theater for 4 continents, the best-loved actress on earth. Then, when she was 71 and broke, she had lost all her money. Her physician, Professor Pazzi of Paris, told her he would have to amputate her leg. While crossing the Atlantic, she had fallen on deck during a storm and injured her leg severely. Phlebitis developed. I don't know what that is. Her leg shrank. The pain became so intense that the doctor felt the leg had to be amputated. He was almost afraid to tell her, the stormy, tempestuous, divine Sarah, what had to be done. He fully expected the terrible news would set off an explosion of hysteria, but he was wrong. Sarah looked at him for a moment, and then quietly said, "If it has to be, it has to be." It was fate. As she was being wheeled away to the operating room, her son stood weeping. She waved to him with a gay gesture and said cheerfully, "Don't go away, I'll be right back." On the way to the operating room, she recited a scene from one of her plays. Someone asked her if she was doing something to cheer herself up. She said no, to cheer up the doctors and the nurses. It will be a strain on them. After recovering from the operation, Sarah Bernhardt went on touring the world and enchanting audiences for another 7 years. "When we stop fighting the inevitable," said Elsie McCormick in a Reader's Digest article, "we release energy which enables us to create a richer life." No one living has enough emotion and vigor to fight the inevitable and, at the same time, enough left over to create a new life. Choose one or the other. You can either bend with inevitable sleet storms of life, or you can resist them and break. I saw that happen on a farm I own in Missouri. I planted a score of trees on that farm. At first they grew with astonishing rapidity. Then a sleet storm encrusted each twig and branch with a heavy coating of ice. Instead of bowing gracefully to their burden, these trees proudly resisted and broke and split under the load, and had to be destroyed. They hadn't learned the wisdom of the forests of the north. I've traveled hundreds of miles through the evergreen forests of Canada, yet I've never seen a spruce or a pine broken by sleet or ice. These evergreen forests know how to bend, and how to bow down their branches, and how to cooperate with the inevitable. The masters of jiu-jitsu teach their pupils to bend like the willow, don't resist like the oak. Why do you think your automobile tires stand up to the road and take so much punishment? At first, the tire manufacturers tried to make a tire that would resist the shocks of the road. It would soon be cut to ribbons. And then they made a tire that would absorb the shocks of the road, that the tire could take it. You and I will last longer and enjoy smoother riding if we learn to absorb the shocks and jolts along the rocky road of life. What will happen to you and me if we resist the shocks of life instead of absorbing them? What will happen if we refuse to bend like the willow and insist on resisting like the oak? The answer is easy. We will set up a series of inner conflicts. We will be worried, tense, strained, and neurotic. If we go still further and reject the harsh world of reality and retreat into a dream world of our own making, we will then be insane. During the war, millions of frightened soldiers had either to accept the inevitable or break under the strain. To illustrate, let's take the case of William H. Caecilius of Glendale, New York. Here is a prize-winning talk he gave before one of my classes in New York. Shortly after I joined the Coast Guard, I was assigned to one of the hottest spots on this side of the Atlantic. I was made a supervisor of explosives. Imagine it, me, a cracker salesman becoming a supervisor of explosives. The very thought of finding yourself standing on top of thousands of tons of TNT was enough to chill the marrow of a cracker salesman's bones. I was given only 2 days of instruction, and what I learned filled me with even more terror. I'll never forget my first assignment. On a dark, cold, foggy day, I was given my orders on the open pier of Caven Point, Bayonne, New Jersey. I was assigned to hold number 5 on my ship. I had to work down in the hold with 5 longshoremen. They had strong backs, but they knew nothing whatever about explosives, and they were loading blockbusters, each one which contained a ton of TNT, enough explosive to blow that old ship to kingdom come. These blockbusters were being lowered by 2 cable slings. I kept saying to myself, suppose one of those cables slipped and broke. Oh boy, I was scared and I trembled. My mouth was dry, my knees sagged, my heart pounded, but I couldn't run away. That would be desertion. I would be disgraced, my parents would be disgraced, and I might be shot for desertion. I couldn't run, I had to stay. I kept looking at the careless way those longshoremen were handling those blockbusters. The ship might be blown up at any minute. After an hour or more, those spine-chilling terror began to use a little common sense. I gave myself a good talking to. I said, "Look here, so you're blown up, so what? You will never know the difference. It'll be an easy way to die, much better than dying by cancer. Don't be a fool. You can't expect to live forever. You've got to do this job, or be shot. You might as well like it." I talked to myself like that for hours and began to feel at ease. Finally, I overcame my worry and fears by forcing myself to accept the inevitable situation. I'll never forget that lesson. Every time I am tempted now to worry about something I can't possibly change, I shrug my shoulders and say, "Forget it." I find that it works, even for a cracker salesman. Hooray! Let's give 3 cheers and 1 cheer more for the cracker salesman of Pinafore. The Pinafore, I guess that's the ship. Outside of the crucifixion of Jesus, the most famous death scene in all of history was the death of Socrates, I guess. 10,000 centuries from now, men will still be reading and cherishing Plato's immortal description of it. One of the most moving and beautiful passages in all of literature. Certain men of Athens, jealous and envious of old, barefooted Socrates, trumped up charges against him and had him tried and condemned to death. When the friendly jailer gave Socrates, the poisoned cup to drink, the jailer said, "Try to bear lightly what needs to be." Socrates did. He faced death with a calmness and resignation that touched the hem of divinity. Try to bear lightly what needs to be. These words were spoken 399 years before Christ was born. But this worrying old world needs those words today more than it ever did before. Try to bear lightly what needs must be. What needs must be. Try to bear lightly what needs must be. I've been reading practically every book and magazine article I could find that dealt even remotely with banishing worry. Would you like to know what is the single best bit of advice about worry that I have ever discovered in all that reading? Well, here it is, summed up in 27 words. Words that you and I ought to paste on our bathroom mirrors, so that each time we wash our faces, we could also wash away our worries from our minds. This priceless prayer was written by Dr. Reinhold Niebuhr. God grant me serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. To break the worry habit before it breaks you, rule number 4 is cooperate with the inevitable. Let's read this priceless prayer again. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Would you like to know how to make money on Wall Street? Well, so would a million other people. And if I knew the answer, this book would sell for $10,000 a copy. However, there's one good idea that some successful operators use. And this story was told to me by Charles Roberts, an investment counselor. Quote, "I originally came up to New York from Texas with $20,000, which my friends had given me to invest in the stock market," Charles Roberts told me. "I thought," he continued, "that I knew the ropes of the stock market, but I lost every cent. True, I made a lot of profit on some deals, but I ended up losing everything. I did not mind so much losing my own money," Mr. Roberts explained, "but I felt terrible about having lost my friends' money, even though they could well afford it. I dreaded facing them again after our venture had turned out so unfortunately. But to my astonishment, they not only were good sports about it, but proved to be incurable optimists. I knew I had been trading on a hit-or-miss basis and depending largely on luck and other people's opinions. I had been playing the stock market by ear. I began to think over my mistakes, and I determined that before I went back to the market again, I would try to find out what it was all about. So I sought out and became acquainted with one of the most successful speculators who had ever lived, Burton S. Castles. I believed I could learn a great deal from him because he had long enjoyed the reputation of being successful year after year, and I knew that such a career was not the result of mere chance or luck. He asked me a few questions about how I traded before and then told me what I believe is the most important principle in trading. He said, I put a stop-loss order on every market commitment I make. If I buy a stock, say $50 a share, I immediately place a stop-loss order on it at 45. That means when and if the stock should decline as much as 5 points below its cost, it would be sold automatically, thereby limiting the loss to 5 points. If your commitments are largely intelligently made in the first place, the old master continued, your profits will average 10, 25, or even 50 points. Consequently, by limiting your losses to 5 points, you can be wrong more than half of the time and still make plenty of money. I adopted that principle immediately and have used it ever since. It has saved my clients and me thousands of dollars. After a while, I realized that the stop-loss principle could be used in other ways besides the stock market. I began to place stop-loss orders on other worries besides financial ones. I began to place a stop-loss order on any and every kind of annoyance and resentment that came to me, and it worked like magic. For example, I often have a luncheon date with a friend who is rarely on time. In the old days, he used to keep me stewing around for half my lunch hour before he showed up. Finally, I told him about my stop-loss orders on my worries, and I said, Bill, my stop-loss order on waiting for you is exactly 10 minutes. If you arrive more than 10 minutes late, our lunch engagement will be sold down the river, and I'll be gone. Man alive, how I wish I had that sense years ago to put stop-loss orders on my impatience, on my temper, and my desire for self-justification, on my regrets, and all of my mental and emotional strains. Why didn't I have the horse sense to size up each situation that threatened to destroy my peace of mind and say to myself, see here, Dale Carnegie, this situation is worth just as much fussing about and no more. Why didn't I? However, I must give myself credit for a little sense. On one occasion, at least, and it was a serious occasion too, a crisis in my life. A crisis when I stood watching my dreams, my plans for the future, and the work of years vanish into thin air. It happened like this. In my early 30s, I had decided to spend my life writing novels. I was going to be a second Frank Norris or Jack London or Thomas Hardy. I was so in earnest that I spent 2 years in Europe, where I could live cheaply with dollars during the period of wild printing press money that followed the First World War. I spent 2 years there writing my magnum opus. I called it The Blizzard. The title was a natural, for the reception it got among publishers was cold as any blizzard that ever howled across the plains of the Dakotas. When my literary agent told me it was worthless, that I had no gift, no talent, no fiction, my heart almost stopped. I left his office in a daze. I couldn't have been more stunned if he had hit me across the head with a club. I was stupefied. I realized that I was standing at the crossroads of life and had to make a tremendous decision. What should I do? Which way should I turn? Weeks passed before I came out of the daze. At the time, I had never heard the phrase, put a stop-loss order on your worries. But as I look back now, I could see that I did just that. I wrote off my 2 years of sweating over the novel for just what they were worth. A noble experiment. And went forward from there. I returned to my work of organizing and teaching adult education classes and wrote biographies in my spare time. Biographies and nonfiction books such as the one you are reading now. And I am glad that I made this decision? Glad? Every time I think about it, I now feel like dancing in the street for sheer joy. I can honestly say that I have never spent a day or an hour since lamenting the fact that I am not another Thomas Hardy. One night, a century ago, when a screech owl was screeching in the woods along the shores of Walden Pond, Henry Thoreau dipped his goose quill into his homemade ink and wrote in his diary, "The cost of a thing is the amount of what I call life. which is required to be exchanged for it immediately or in the long run. I'm going to read that one more time. The cost of a thing is the amount of what I call life, which is required to be exchanged for it immediately or in the long run. To put it another way, we are fools when we overpay for a thing in terms of what it takes out of a very existence. I guess the same thing goes when I was laid off during COVID by my architecture firm. While, of course, it was, a crappy situation, probably when I look back back on that moment, in 5 years from now, I'm going to be so happy that they pulled off that Band-Aid for me, because I was thinking about quitting, and I wasn't happy, but the security kept me there, really. So, it's like I can complain and moan, oh, why didn't they see me as a valued employee? How come they fired me? And not fired, but laid me off? And why was I downsized? But, I can complain all I want, but, for my benefit in the long run, that's what it was good for, right? So kind of the same thing, right? Something bad happened, but it pushed your life in another direction that you were probably even more successful in. So, all right. Yet, that is precisely what Gilbert and Sullivan did. They knew how to create gay words and gay music, but they knew distressingly little about how to create gaiety in their own lives. They created some of the loveliest light operas that have ever delighted the world. Patience, Pinafore, the Mikado, but they couldn't control their tempers. They embittered their years over nothing more than the price of a carpet. Sullivan ordered a new carpet for the theater they had bought. When Gilbert saw the bill, he hit the roof. They battled it out in court and never spoke to one another as long as they lived. When Sullivan wrote the music for a new production, he mailed it to Gilbert, and when Gilbert wrote the words, he mailed them back to Sullivan. Once they had to take a curtain call together, they stood on opposite sides of the stage and bowed in different directions so they wouldn't see one another. They hadn't the sense to put a stop-loss order on their resentments, as Lincoln did. Once, during the Civil War, when some of Lincoln's friends were denouncing his bitter enemies, Lincoln said, "You have more of a feeling of personal resentment than I do. Perhaps I have too little of it, but I never thought it paid. A man doesn't have time to spend half his life in quarrels. If a man ceases to attack me, I never remember the past against him." I was like, don't hold grudges. It's not worth your time. I wish an old aunt of mine, Aunt Edith, I like to say aunt, I guess. I wish an old aunt of mine, Aunt Edith, had had Lincoln's forgiving spirit. She and Uncle Frank lived on a mortgaged farm that was infested with cockleburs and cursed with poor soils and ditches. They had tough going, had to squeeze every nickel. But Aunt Edith loved to buy a few curtains and some other small items to brighten up their bare home. She bought these small luxuries on credit at Dan Eversole's dry goods store in Marysville, Missouri. Uncle Frank worried about their debts. He had a farmer's horror of running up bills, so he secretly told Dan Eversole to stop letting his wife buy on credit. When she heard that, she hit the roof, and she was still hitting the roof about it almost 50 years after it happened. I've heard her tell that story not once, but many times. The last time I ever saw her, she was in her late 70s. I told her, "Aunt Edith, Uncle Frank did wrong to humiliate you, but don't you honestly feel that you're complaining about it almost half a century after it happened is infinitely worse than what he did?" I might as well have said to the moon. Aunt Edith paid dearly for the grudges and bitter memories that she nourished. She paid for them with her own peace of mind. When Benjamin Franklin was 7 years old, he made a mistake that he remembered for 70 years. When he was a lad of 7, he fell in love with a whistle. He was so excited about it that he went into the toy shop, piled all his coppers on the counter, and demanded the whistle without even asking its price. "I then came home," he wrote to a friend, 70 years later, and went whistling all over the house, much pleased with my whistle. But when his older brother and sister found out that he had paid far more for his whistle than he should have paid, they gave him the horse laugh, and he said, I cried with vexation. Years later, when Franklin was world famous and an ambassador to France, he still remembered that fact that he paid too much for his whistle had caused him, quote, more chagrin than the whistle gave him pleasure. But the lesson it taught Franklin was cheap in the end. As I grew up, he said, I came into the world and observed the actions of men. I thought I met with many, very many, who gave too much for the whistle. In short, I conceived that a great part of the miseries of mankind are brought up by false estimates they have made of their value of things, and by their giving too much for their whistles. Gilbert and Sullivan paid too much for their whistle, and so did Aunt Edith. So did Dale Carnegie on many occasions, and so did the immortal Leo Tolstoy, author of two of the world's greatest novels, War and Peace and Anna Karenina. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, Leo Tolstoy was, during the last 20 years of his life, quote, probably the most venerated man in the whole world. For 20 years before he died, from 1890 to 1910, an unending stream of admirers made pilgrimages to his home in order to catch a glimpse of his face, to hear the sound of his voice, or even to touch the hem of his garment. Every sentence he uttered was taken down into a notebook, almost as if it were, quote, divine revelation. But when it came to living, to ordinary living, well, Tolstoy had made even less sense at 70 than Franklin had at 7. He had no sense at all. And here's what I meant. Tolstoy married a girl he loved very dearly. In fact, they were so happy together that they used to get on their knees and pray to God to let them continue their lives in such sheer heavenly ecstasy. But the girl Tolstoy married was jealous by nature. She used to dress herself up as a peasant and spy on his movements. Even out in the woods, they had fearful rows. She became so jealous even of her own children that she grabbed a gun and shot a hole in her daughter's photograph. She even rolled on the floor with an opium bottle held to her lips and threatened to commit suicide, while the children huddled in a corner of the room and screamed with terror. And what did Tolstoy do? Well, I don't blame the man for up and smashing the furniture. He had good provocation. But he did far worse than that. He kept a private diary. Yes, a diary in which he placed all the blame on his wife. That was his whistle. He was determined to make sure that coming generations would exonerate him and put the blame on his wife. And what did his wife do in answer to all this? Why, she tore pages out of his diary and burned them, of course. She started a diary of her own in which she made him the villain. She even wrote a novel titled Whose Fault?, in which she depicted her husband as a household fiend and herself as a martyr. All to what end? Why did these two people turn the only home they had into what Tolstoy himself called a lunatic asylum? Obviously, there were several reasons. One of those reasons was the burning desire to impress you and me. Yes, we all have the. Yes, we are at the posterity. No, we're used to using the word posterity in this one. Yes, we are the posterity whose opinion they were worried about. It's the first time I heard posterity used in that way. Do we give a hoot in Hades about which one was to blame? No, we are too concerned with our own problems to waste a minute thinking about the Tolstoys. What a price these two wretched people paid for their whistle. 50 years after living in a venerable hell, just because neither of them had the sense to say stop, because neither of them had enough judgment of value to say, let's put a stop-loss order on this thing instantly. We are squandering our lives. Let's say, enough now. Yes, I honestly believe that this is one of the greatest secrets to true peace of mind, a decent sense of values. And I believe we could annihilate 50% of our worries all at once if we would develop a sort of private gold standard, a gold standard of what things are worth to us in terms of our lives. So to break the worry habit before it breaks you, here's rule number 5. When we're tempted to throw good money after bad in terms of human living, let's stop and ask ourselves these 3 questions. Number 1, how much does this thing I'm worrying about really matter to me? 2, at what point shall I set a stop-loss order on this worry and forget about it? And 3, exactly how much shall I pay for this whistle? Have I already paid more than it's worth? Chapter 11. Don't try to saw sawdust. As I write this sentence, I can look out of my window and see some dinosaur tracks in my garden. Dinosaur tracks embedded in shale and stone. I purchased those dinosaur tracks from the Peabody Museum of Yale University, and I have a letter from the curator of the Peabody Museum saying those tracks were made 180 million years ago. Even a Mongolian idiot wouldn't dream of trying to go back 180 million years to change those tracks. Throwing shade at the Mongolians. Yet that would not be any more foolish than worrying because we can't go back and change what happened 180 seconds ago. And a lot of us are doing just that. To be sure, we may do something to modify the effects of what happened 180 seconds ago, but we can't possibly change the event that occurred then. There's only one way on God's green footstool that the past can be constructive, and that is by calmly analyzing our past mistakes and profiting from them and forgetting them. I know that is true, but I've always had the courage and sense to do it. To answer that question, let me tell you about a fantastic experience I had years ago. I let more than $350,000 slip through my fingers without making a penny's profit. It happened like this. I launched a large-scale enterprise in adult education, opened branches in various cities, and spent money lavishly in overhead and advertising. I was so busy with teaching that I never had the time nor the desire to look after the finances. I was too naive to realize that I needed an astute business manager to watch expenses. Finally, after about a year, I discovered a sobering and shocking truth. I discovered that in spite of our enormous intake, we had not netted any profit whatsoever. After discovering that, I should have done 2 things. First, I should have done the sense to do what George Washington Carver did when he lost $40,000 in a bank crash, the savings of a lifetime. When someone asked him if he knew he was bankrupt, he would say, "Yes, I heard," and went on with his teaching. He wiped the loss out of his mind so completely that he never mentioned it again. Here is the second thing I should have done. I should have analyzed my mistake and learned a lasting lesson. Reminds me of all the people losing money in Bitcoin with their margins. Here's the second thing I should have done. I should have analyzed my mistakes and learned the lasting lesson. But frankly, I didn't do either one of these things. Instead, I went into a tailspin of worry. For months, I was in a daze. I lost sleep and I lost weight. Instead of learning a lesson from this enormous mistake, I went right ahead and did the same thing again on a smaller scale. It is embarrassing for me to admit all of this stupidity, but I discovered long ago that, quote, it is easier to teach 20 what were good to be done. What? It is easier to teach 20 what were good to be done than to be one of the 20 to follow mine own teaching. It is easier to teach 20 what were good to be done than to be one of the 20 to follow mine own teaching. He's quoting something, so it's better to be teaching than just learning. I don't understand. How I wish that I had had the privilege of attending the George Washington High School here in New York and studying under Dr. Paul Brandwine, the same teacher who taught Alan Sanders of New York. Mr. Saunders told me that the teacher of his hygiene class, Dr. Paul Brandwine, taught him one of those most valuable lessons he had ever learned. I was only in my teens, said Alan Saunders as he told me the story, but I was a worrier even then. I used to stew and fret about the mistakes I had made. If I turned in an examination paper, I used to lie awake and chew my fingernails for fear I hadn't passed. I was always living over the things I had done and wishing I had done them differently, thinking over the things I had said and wishing I said them better. Then one morning our class filed into the science laboratory, and there was the teacher, Dr. Paul Brandwine, with a bottle of milk promptly displayed on the edge of his desk. We all sat down staring at the milk and wondered what had to do with hygiene, with a hygiene course he was teaching. Then all of a sudden, Dr. Brandwine stood up, swept the bottle of milk with a crash into the sink, and shouted, "Don't cry over spilt milk." Then he made us all come to the sink and look at the wreckage. "Take a good look," he told us, "because I want you to remember this lesson for the rest of your lives. That milk is gone. You can see it's down the drain, and all the fussing and hair pulling in the world won't bring back a drop of it. With a little thought and prevention, that milk might have been saved, but it's too late now. All we can do is write it off, forget it, and go on to the next thing." That one little demonstration, Alan Saunders told me, stuck with me a long time after I'd forgotten my solid geometry in Latin. In fact, it taught me more about practical living than anything else in my 4 years of high school. It taught me to keep from spilling milk if I could, but to completely forget it once it was spilt and had gone down the drain. Some readers are going to snort at the idea of making so much over a hackneyed proverb over "don't cry over spilt milk." I know it is trite, commonplace, and a platitude. I know you have heard it 1,000 times, but I also know that these hackneyed proverbs contain the very essence of the distilled wisdom of ages. They have come out of the fiery experience of the human race and have been handed down through countless generations. If you were to read everything that has ever been written about worry by the great scholars of all time, you would never read anything more basic or more profound than such hackneyed proverbs as, "Don't cross your bridges until you come to them," and "Don't cry over spilt milk." If we only applied these two proverbs instead of snorting at them, we wouldn't need this book at all. In fact, if we applied most of the old proverbs, we would lead almost perfect lives. However, knowledge isn't power until it is applied, and the purpose of this book is not to tell you something new. The purpose of this book is to remind you of what you already know and to kick you in the shins and inspire you to do something about applying it. I've always admired a man like the late Fred Fuller Shedd, who had a gift for stating an old truth in a new and picturesque way. While editor at the Philadelphia Bulletin and addressing a college graduating class, he asked, "How many of you have ever sawed wood? Let's see your hands." Most of them had. Then he inquired, "How many of you have ever sawed sawdust?" No hands went up. "Of course you can't saw sawdust," Mr. Shedd exclaimed. "It's already sawed." And it's the same with the past. When you start worrying about things that are over and done with, you're merely trying to saw sawdust. When Connie Mack, the grand old man of baseball, was 81 years old, I asked him if he had ever worried over the games that were lost. "Oh yes, I used to," Connie Mack told me. "But I got over that foolishness long years ago. I found out it didn't get me anywhere at all. You can't grind any grain," he said, quote, "with water that has already gone down the creek." No, you can't grind any grain. You can't saw any logs with water that has already gone down the creek. But you can saw wrinkles in your face and ulcers in your stomach. I had dinner with Jack Dempsey one Thanksgiving, and he told me over the turkey and cranberry sauce about the fight in which he lost the heavyweight championship to Tunney. Naturally, it was a blow to his ego. Quote, "In the midst of that fight," he told me, "I suddenly realized I had become an old man. And at the end of the 10th round, I was still on my feet. But that was about all. My face was puffed and cut, and my eyes were nearly closed. I saw the referee raise Gene Tunney's hand in token of victory. I was no longer champion of the world. I started back in the rain, back through the crowd in my dressing room. As I passed, some people tried to grab my hand. Others had tears in their eyes. A year later, I fought Tunny again, but it was no use. I was through forever. It was hard to keep from worrying about it. But I used to say to myself, quote, I'm not going to live in the past or cry over spilt milk. I'm going to take this blow on the chin and not let it floor me. And that is precisely what Jack Dempsey did. How? By saying to himself over and over again, I won't worry about the past. No, that would be merely to force him to think about his past worries. He did it by accepting and writing off his defeat and then concentrating on plans for the future. He did it by running the Jack Dempsey restaurant on Broadway and the Great Northern Hotel on 57th Street. He did it by promoting prize fights and giving boxing exhibitions. He did it by getting so busy on something constructive that he had neither the time nor the temptation to worry about the past. I had had a better time during the last 10 years, Jack Dempsey said, than I had when I was champion. Mr. Dempsey told me that he had not read my many books, but without knowing it, he was following Shakespeare's advice. Quote, wise men never sit and wail their loss, but cheerily seek how to redress their harms. As I read history and biography and observe people under trying circumstances, I am constantly astonished and inspired by some people's ability to write off their worries and tragedies and go on living fairly happy lives. I once paid a visit to Sing Sing, and the thing about that astonished me the most was that the prisoners there appeared to be as happy as the average person on the outside. I commented it to Louis E. Laws, then warden of Sing Sing, and he told me that when criminals first arrive at Sing Sing, they're likely to be resentful and bitter, but after a few months, the majority of the more intelligent ones write off their misfortunes and settle down and accept prison life calmly and make their best of it. Warden Laws told me about one Sing Sing prisoner, a gardener, who sang as he cultivated the vegetables and flowers inside the prison walls. That Sing Sing prisoner who sang as he cultivated the flowers showed a lot more sense than most of us do. He knew that, a little poem I'm about to read. He knew that the moving finger writes, and having writ, moves on. Nor all your piety or wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all your tears wash out a word of it. So why waste the tears? Of course, we have been guilty of blunders and absurdities, and so what? Who hasn't? Even Napoleon lost 1/3 of all of his important battles he fought. Perhaps our batting average is no worse than Napoleon's. Who knows? And anyhow, all the king's horses and all the king's men can't put together the past together again. So, let's remember rule number 7. Don't try to saw sawdust. Okay, that's part 3 in a nutshell. Part 4 is next chapter. So we're going to just here briefly revisit the 5 rules, and they're in the description below if you want to read them yourself. Okay, rule number 1. Crowd worry out of your mind by keeping busy. Plenty of action is one of the best therapies ever devised for curing wibber gibbers. Rule number 2. Don't fuss about trifles. Don't permit little things, the mere termites of life, to ruin your happiness. Rule 3. Use the law of averages to outlaw your worries. Ask yourself, what are the odds against this thing happening at all? Rule number 4. Cooperate with the inevitable. If you know circumstances beyond your power to change or revise, say to yourself, it is so, it cannot be otherwise. Rule number 5. Put a stop-loss order on your worries. Decide just how much anxiety a thing may be worth, and refuse to give it any more. And rule number 6, let the past bury its dead. Don't saw sawdust.